Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome Stanley Liu. He's a cardiologist, and today's Kevin MD article is 5 steps to ride out a non-compete without uprooting your family. Stanley, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me, Kevin.
All right, so just briefly share your story and then jump right into the Kevin MD article that you shared with us today.
Yeah, I am a cardiologist by training. I formerly was an academic cardiologist, and I ended up leaving and writing out a non-compete period, which is what the
Okay.
article is about, because I wanted to create a life that I couldn't create through my full-time employment practice previously. Today, I split my time doing part-time locums work. I work for a value-based care startup in my hometown of Baltimore, and I'm also a licensed financial planner for physicians. So I have three separate part-time careers, but most importantly, I'm also husband and father to two young children, and I'm very present in their lives much more than before.
Perfect. And a lot of people, of course, spend decades becoming a cardiologist like yourself. So, what was your inspiration to kind of wear some of these non-clinical hats?
Yeah, thanks for that great question. You're right. We all go through a lot of training. I always had interest in personal finance. I was actually teaching med students in like an actual course about personal finance for medical students, physicians, and I often gave talks to residents and fellows and often to medical societies as well. And honestly, to the point where I was being asked more to give talks on that topic than
Mhm.
cardiology. And honestly, I had mixed feelings about that as an academic cardiologist. But I realized it was something that I did pretty well and started seriously thinking about going professional before I left my full-time cardiology practice.
All right. So, what you say is absolutely right. I've been doing this podcast for years now, and the topic of anything financial, contracts, that is something that medical students and residents and early career physicians definitely need more education on. Now, one aspect of that, of course, is non-competes, and you're going to talk about that in your Kevin MD article. For those that didn't get a chance to read it, just share what your article's about.
Yeah, the reason I wrote it, Kevin, was because I was kind of making it up as I went. I didn't do the traditional thing where I left with a job offer in hand.
Yeah.
I had an 18-month, 20-mile non-compete on my contract. And so when I realized that, my current job was untenable and I had to find something else, I had to think about what made sense for my family. I hadn't even been
Mhm.
actively job searching at the time. And this ended up being a calculated risk of what did I think I could manage during those 18 months? How well could my family and I handle the worst case scenario? And were we willing to take that risk? Was my wife on board with that? And so it was both a financial as well as a psychological and real like strategy, type decision that my wife and I ended up doing it. And we just came out on the other side in 2025. And I know lots of people who are struggling with career decisions because of non-competes. So I decided to write down what it was that my wife and I thought about and the obstacles we overcame to get through it so that people can learn from our experience.
All right. So tell us a little bit about that calculus that you and your wife made. Tell us about all the factors that went into that decision-making process.
So the first thing was we had to we couldn't just dream. It had to be financially possible.
Hmm.
And so one of the things that we started doing as soon as I realized that I started seriously considering my job was to build a worst case scenario fund. In personal finance speak, we often talk about that as an emergency fund. And we
Hmm.
often, we'll say like 3 to 6 months, that kind of thing, in case something bad happens. That's, typically recommended. I was looking at a situation where what if I couldn't practice medicine for 18 months?
Yeah.
And what we ended up doing was we decided to save up a 12-month fund. That was okay for us, given our household situation, our financial situation, the fact that my wife works, and the job market for cardiologists at the time. That was enough for us to sleep at night. That might be different for others, depending on their situation, their psychology. But first, we had to pick out an amount that with which we could sleep at night in case of a worst case scenario. And the reason that is so important is because that sets the stage for everything else. When I started doing this, I was still potentially trying to save my job and I
Yeah.
wanted to negotiate favorable terms, or if I wanted to negotiate with other jobs, I wanted to be coming from a position of strength
Hmm.
and never be in a situation where I had to either bluff or plead during a negotiation. That
Sure.
just does not work out well. And I did not have a job offer in hand. This was the next best thing.
So, in terms of non-competes, you mentioned that you weren't able to practice within a certain mile radius. Was your non-compete comparable to what other physicians face? Was it a typical non-compete, or was there anything special about your particular non-compete?
Yeah, so there is a lot of variability throughout the country. I'm actually the advocacy chair of the Maryland chapter of the ACC, and one of our biggest victories last year in 2024 was making non-competes for healthcare workers partially illegal.
Yeah.
And that is already the case in many states, whereas other states, there are no restrictions on that. And so I've seen non-competes range anywhere from a few miles to, to like 50 miles in rural areas or things like that, and it can really, really range. Now, how enforceable they are can also range because if a judge thinks that, it is egregious or it hurts the, patient population, that may not be enforceable. So it really varies. Mine, I would say for my area, it's considered pretty restrictive. 20 miles in for 18 months is pretty up there in a smaller, more suburban or urban state, but that there is a lot of variability out there.
And when we talk about the enforceability of non-competes, how stringent are they? Because I've heard cases that if hypothetically you were to find a new job, sometimes your new employer can negotiate with your old employer and maybe negotiate that non-compete out. So, how ironclad was your particular case?
So in my particular case, I consulted with a contract attorney who told me that in the state of Maryland at the time, it was very enforceable. My personal experience was that I did end up being recruited by a local Baltimore healthcare facility that fell within the radius. And when they found out about the non-compete, they simply did not want to take on that risk.
Mhm.
They didn't want to, that was just too big of a unnecessary headache from their perspective. So my answer to the question is it depends on how badly the new job wants you, but recognize that even in a situation where a non-compete clause could be considered non-enforceable by a judge, your new job or practice may not even want to take on
Yeah.
the headache of that risk. And because of that, the presence of a non-compete alone already does have some weight, even if it's not quote unquote ironclad or enforceable.
So you were in this gray area of potentially up to 18 months, and you talked to your wife about creating up to a 1 year emergency financial fund. So tell us what else you did during that time.
Well, the whole point of this for our family was I wanted to prioritize, health, marriage, and family as my kids were starting school. I wanted to be there, when my kids get on the bus and coach their soccer teams, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But you can imagine how my wife might feel about this if I told her, "Hey, I got this great idea. I'm gonna quit my job
Hmm.
and I'm not gonna work as a doctor within 20 miles of where we live. Isn't that a great idea?" We wanted to make sure this is sustainable. So
Yeah.
we came up with some very non-financial guidelines to set as a guiding compass here. And so I'll tell you the ones that we actually wrote down. One of the decisions we made was that leaving this job had to be the best thing that ever happened to our marriage.
Hmm.
And the net effect of this had to be more flexibility and agency for my wife's interests and career, not less. Like she could not be more restricted in her personal and professional goals as a result. And I also decided I had to be making at least half of what I made in my old position within a year, or we scrap this and I go back to a full-time job.
Hmm.
And that was our deciding factor. And and having those principles and that future you want to build is really important because you will be tempted to go back to your old job
Yeah.
or lose yourself, especially for doctors who we've spent years or decades following a regimented path and straying off the beaten path for doctors is really hard. It's really
Yeah.
disorienting. You get a lot of peer pressure, like weird looks, like, what are you doing? Are you having a midlife crisis? That kind of thing. So having that clear future is really important. That's one thing that we did.
So, typical advice, which you went against, was you should never quit your job unless you have the next one in hand. So, you talk about this period of 12 to 18 months, a little bit uncertainty professionally. So clearly there's some non-clinical options that you lean into because you, according to your story, you do so many things outside of clinical medicine. Was this the time where you kind of looked at non-clinical cardiology options to help sustain you financially?
Yes and no. This was a time where I was thinking about non-clinical options, but during my actual non-compete period, all of the income I made was clinical. I did that through part-time locum tenens work about 2 hours away from where I live. And so it was a time where I did have to explore and choose new sources of income, and I looked at both clinical and non-clinical sources of income. And again, that's why it's really important to have that future that you're trying to build instead of just trying to escape from something bad, because it'll be really easy to just take the first thing that you can get to keep paying the bills. And I wanted to do it from a very calm and intentional point with the goal of improving our overall well-being.
So walk us a little bit through that process because, like you said, a lot of physicians are pigeonholed into clinical medicine because that's what they've been doing and studying for literally decades. And a lot of doctors I talk to, they don't know how to do anything else or don't have any other interests outside of medicine. So walk us through your process in terms of sustaining yourself financially when you couldn't have that full-time clinical job.
Yeah, and Kevin, I have the same conversation with a lot of people who say, like, look, I've spent a decade training to be a doctor. This is what I do. What else could I do?
Yeah.
And my counter argument is always think about what you had to learn during each year of your training. Like the learning curve, what you were able to accomplish that you could not have even foreseen yourself doing 5 years previously. If anyone is better able to pivot and learn something new and adapt, it's us doctors. We did that
Mhm.
with every rotation in medical school. We did that and with every rotation in residency. And so part of this is mindset of getting back that mindset of saying, hey, I am not a fixed person with unchanging skills. I am someone who has specialized in learning and adapting new skills and using them to help people. And if you can really believe that and regain that mentality, then I think that frees you into opening your eyes and seeing other options that are out there, clinical or non-clinical, in which you could not only generate revenue, but really create value for those and for the rest of the world.
Now, did you have any mentors? Did you go to any physician forums? Because sometimes this is the path that's relatively less taken. Where did you look to guidance in terms of finding out what you wanted to do?
Yeah, this is a great question, Kevin. And, there are very few people who are both practicing cardiologists and practicing regulated licensed financial planners out there. I did find people who had left medicine to go into financial planning, and I did talk to them. I talked to mentors of mine who I trusted within medicine, who knew me not just for my clinical skill, but also who what my values are, that kind of thing, to bounce ideas off. And to people who are non-clinical, people who've known me since I was young, to really get a good sense of, am I thinking about this right way? What are my blind spots? Because you're right, this was hard. I did not have a mentor who has done what I've done. I've had to piece together life lessons learned from others that I respect and put them together and see how I could use their experiences to help guide my own journey.
Now, let's say you had to replay this again. Is there anything that you would have done differently if you had to go through this a second time?
Well, launching the non-clinical business took far longer than I expected. The clinical work I did, I ended up making less than I expected because the nature of no locums work is it can be canceled with 30 days notice on either side. And I did have an unexpected breach of contract from a hospital that I was contracted with that I had to that I had to work around. So I went sometimes 3 months without income, and that was a hard thing. Would I've done anything differently? I'm glad we had that emergency fund because that's what let me, you know, help me sleep at night and find the next plan B or plan C. Maybe I would have been a little less optimistic about my non-clinical income, projections, but in the end, it didn't matter, because we had enough reserve and we still got to where we wanted to be. We accomplished the goal of getting through it and building a life that's much better.
Now, what can you tell other physicians who may be listening to you now? I talk to a lot of physicians who may be dissatisfied with their current job situation, but perhaps a non-compete is keeping them into an unsatisfactory condition. What kind of advice or insight or wisdom can you share with these physicians who may be in an unhappy situation but have to stay there because of the threat of a potential non-compete?
The the biggest thing is to take away the power of that non-compete. The whole point of the non-compete is to keep you trapped because the cost of extracting yourself from a suboptimal job is higher than the cost of staying there. And the way you can do that is the traditional advice. You can have a job offer in hand from somewhere else. If you're planning to move somewhere else, that's fine. The non-compete's not an issue. But if you're committed to your community, you don't want to, uproot yourself and your family, you got to put yourself in a situation where that non-compete does not have power over you. Part of that is financial, making sure that you're not dependent on every paycheck, that you can either get to a point where you're working less, a little farther away, or you can stomach some period of in between then and your next forever job. How you do that is up to you, but a big part of that is financial. Equally important, though, is making sure you have a clear vision of what you are looking for. Otherwise, at the end of the day, you could end up in a job that is just as equally unsatisfying because all you did was try to escape toxicity rather than build something positive that you are moving toward.
We're talking to Stanley Liu. He is a cardiologist and financial planner. Today's Kevin MD article is 5 steps to ride out a non-compete without uprooting your family. Stanley, let's end with some take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
Kevin, thank you so much for having me. The biggest takeaway I hope people have is that you don't have to be trapped. Think about the power a non-compete has over you. It tends to be restrictive because of finances. With good financial planning, you can take away that power, and with the right mindset, realizing that you have been selected as an elite physician who is able to evolve and adapt year after year, there is no question you can create new options and new paths to explore that will make your life better. So take away the power of the non-compete financially and regain your power to create your own path as you did when you became a doctor.
Stanley, wise words. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight, and thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Kevin. It was a pleasure.